This is an unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic:
the religious chairs in the universities in Passion for Truth award-winning program.
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. In the 1970s, some universities pioneered the idea of privately funded professorships in Pacific religions by establishing specific chairs. Our question whether the chairs have enhanced the teachings of a particular religion for the community that sponsored such chairs. All next with our panelist, Dr. Walter Laundrie, a former State Department official, also a founder of Think Tank for National Self-Determination. He's also writing a book on emerging nations. Dr. Dennis Warner is a representative of Pax Christi, the International Catholic Peace Movement, also a senior technical advisor to Catholic Relief Services. Benjamin Marsh, Washington coordinator of Dalit Freedom Network. Dr. Ujagar Singh Bawa, Professor Emeritus, University of Bloomsburg. Dr. Bawa has written a number of books on Sikh history and Sikh scriptures, and he has expertise in the inner dynamics of whether chairs can be beneficial or harmful for religious groupings in the university settings. And Antonio Gracefo, writer of famous books and film star. Mr. Antonio is a motivational speaker who imparts a message of empowerment in a variety of languages. His writings have appeared in several newspapers and journals. Welcome you all. Starting with you, Walter, you think the professors have to compromise their concerns about academic freedom?
No, I don't. In fact, I question the thesis that there's a rising influence of religious groups in the United States. It's even less in Europe, but I think it's not that significant in the United States. If anything, I think religion has been in decline in this country. So I would disagree with the premise of your question, but on the secondary point of whether they have to compromise their academic standards, it depends what their contractual relationship with the university is, whether it's private or public, and so on. You can't answer it generally. But if it's a private university and they have a deal for them to do a certain thing with that university involving their religious teaching, then they have to comply because that's part of the agreement. If it's not, then it's a different situation.
Dennis, the problem is that the universities in U.S. have usually hired religious studies professors regardless of whether they had expertise or track record in the faith that they researched, and consequently it has offended the sponsors.
Well, I'm not sure of the statement that they've usually hired them. I think universities have a requirement to hire people who are qualified to deal with that religious issue, if that's what they're being hired for, in an academic and a scholarly way. And as Walt says, I think it depends on the contract that the professor is working under. If he's working in a seminary, for instance, well then obviously it has to be not just faith-based, but faith-promoting.
Yes.
If he or she is working in a public institution funded with public monies, then it must be from a scholarly standpoint, not promoting the faith, but trying to explain it in terms of the concepts and traditions that we know.
Have the chairs been enhanced the teachings of a particular religion, or have they benefited a particular community that sponsored such chairs?
I think it works both ways, both the instances you talked about. I think in some cases you've had chairs, I'm sure in the past, who were hired by a specific community. I think we're going to get into some of this, that thought they were of a certain mindset, and it turned out that they weren't. Perhaps they were more liberal within a stream of faith, where their benefactors thought that they were more conservative or more in line with their mainline teaching. But I think in general, whenever you can increase the amount of discussion about faith and make it honest discussion, then you're doing well. And I think if it takes, specific people putting up the money to hire representatives of religions, but I think a lot of times these questions are solved by the student body before it ever enters the classroom. There's so many different representatives of religion in the student bodies that they make sure that their religions are properly represented when they go into the classrooms and when they talk with each other.
Speaking of student bodies, Dr. Bawa, the Sikhs contemplated several chairs in Sikh studies in Vancouver, British Columbia, Michigan, and several other places. Have they benefited the Sikh community?
Well, I guess looking at all these gentlemen have mentioned just now, I have 5 criteria that these religious professors have to be judged about. One happens to be that we cannot deny them the academic freedom under the American system. Second is, once they are appointed, they have to be very sensitive to the religious ethos they are representing. Third, they have to be sensitive to the sensitivity of the community itself. They just cannot just go and start marshalling their own ideas. Fourth, they should be really open for discussion. Unfortunately, 6 studies you have mentioned, 6 chairs, we have got 4 chairs now at this time, Michigan, Vancouver.
Give us a very briefly as to what went wrong.
Well, I think in 1 or 2 cases, 2 cases particularly, the folks, those who were appointed those positions, they were supervised by non-Sikhs who were not as proficient in Sikh history or Sikh culture and Sikh literature as they should have been. And the result has been that they have been putting out some research which has really harmed the basic concept of our Sikh tenets, as a matter of fact. And that's where they get questioned by our Sri Akal Takht Sahib more than once. One of them, of course, you have mentioned here in the notes, Peshawar Singh was, his thesis was really very much against our basic canons.
Okay, let me come back to you and go to Antonia. Dr. Baba points an important concept here, that the people who are supervising the professor or a PhD candidate may not be familiar with the religion, and consequently they could reflect their own voices. And we are talking about scholars like MacLeod, who supervised all those 6 chairs for the PhD thesis. The sponsors paid for research done by MacLeod's associates, but MacLeod's biases were reflected in those theses. And what do you do when such cases occur within the university setting?
Well, I think you're always going to have the issue in a university that the supervisor may not have the same expertise, probably doesn't have the same expertise as the professors that he's supervising. So I think we would find these same conflicts in other areas as well. But because we're dealing with religion, it suddenly becomes a very emotional issue. There's a lot of emotion tied in with your religion as well. And I think that we need to recognize that if we're in a non-seminarian type educational system, the approach has to be a scholarly approach rather than, say, a faith-based or a conversion or something along these lines.
But the donors of the chairs, Ben, should review the risks and benefits of chair and anticipate some shake-up of the religious faith and undertake risk in sponsoring such chairs.
It's always a line that you're walking on. It's a tightrope, because on the one hand, if you're sponsoring a chair, you want somebody there that's going to have a similar mindset, that's going to share the same faith, and that you honestly believe is moved by the same spirit that you are. But in the end, if their information that they come out with is contrary to what you believe, but it's right and you're wrong, regardless of how much money you've put up, they're in a situation where they have to have the freedom to maintain what they've discovered, as long as it's confirmed. It can't be just one wild theory. But if it's something that's been put out and peer reviewed and it turns out that it's wrong, then, or that it's correct, excuse me, and you're wrong, then you have to be willing to accept that.
And again, it depends on the type of university we're talking about. If we're talking about public universities, or even the main private universities that are the bedrock of university education in America, they have an obligation to the general public that supersedes any donor bequest. And if the donors are not willing to turn over control of their bequest to the university, then they shouldn't give the money, and the university shouldn't take it if there are strings attached. If it's a public university, or a university that claims academic freedom and the right for professors to pursue things in a scholarly manner, which can be judged by academic standards, then they should be allowed to do it that way.
I strongly agree. In fact, you used the word faith. And once again, when we're talking about a university, I don't expect that the